scripture is taken from the second book of Samuel, chapter 18, verses 24 through 31 rather. 31. Now David was sitting between the two gates, and the watchman went up to the roof, over the gate, to the wall, lifted his eyes and looked, and there was a man running alone. Then the watchman cried out and told the king, and the king said, "If he is alone, there is news in his mouth." And he came rapidly and drew near. Then the watchman saw another man running, and the watchman called to the gatekeeper and said, "There is another man running alone." And the king said, "He also brings news." So the watchman said, "I think the running of the first is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok." And the king said, "He is a good man and comes with good news." So Ahimaaz called out and said to the king, "All is well." Then he bowed down with his face to the earth before the king and said, "Blessed be the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who raised their hand against my lord the king." The king said, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" Ahimaaz answered, "When Joab sent the king's servant and me, your servant, I saw a great tumult, but I did not know what it was about." And the king said, "Turn aside and stand here." So he turned aside and stood still. Just then the Cushite came, and the Cushite said, "There is good news, my lord the king, for the Lord has avenged you this day of all those who rose against you." Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church.
Well, this morning I will complete a three-part sermon series that's been entitled Problems and Prayers. And we've looked at the prayers David prayed throughout the course of his lifetime. First, we considered the time when his relationship with Jonathan is severed because of the political intrigue between Jonathan and Saul, and how David, through all of those difficult moments, never stopped believing that God had a destiny for him. Last week, we remembered the problem of the personal crisis when David has an inappropriate relationship with Bathsheba, and his simple prayer of confession restores within him the moral compass for living. This morning, I invite us to be attentive to one of the more tragic moments in the biblical record. David's son, Absalom, has risen in a military revolt against his father. Absalom has died in battle. And King David weeps. He weeps even though his kingdom is safe, his reign secure. But he weeps nonetheless, because the cost of saving his kingdom was the life of his son. I think it's helpful to remember that the reason we tell tragic stories is so we don't end up living tragic lives. And might we learn from all that David prayed, how we can break out of tragic trajectories when we find ourselves on them. Now, Absalom's revolt did not just suddenly appear. The writer of 2 Samuel goes to great length to tell us that there are forces at play in Absalom's revolt that were set in motion years earlier. Absalom had a sister named Tamar, And Absalom had a half-brother named Amnon. Now, Amnon becomes so obsessed with Tamar that he just can't think straight. The writer of 2 Samuel calls it love, but it does not sound like love to me. It sounds like an unhealthy obsession. But no one around picked up on it. The whole kingly family sweeps it under the rug. Amnon, trying to manipulate the situation to act on this obsessiveness in his own life, pretends to be sick. And in his pretending to be sick, he says, "Only Tamar can help me. Please, Father, send her to me." One wonders how King David could be so blind to this manipulation. But blind he is, sending his daughter into Amnon's chamber. And once there, Amnon manipulates all the others present, asking them to leave, that he might eat the cakes that Tamar has prepared for him. They all leave. And when they are alone, Amnon forces himself upon his half-sister Tamar. Well, both Absalom and David become fully aware of this horrific event. And Absalom waits for his father to do the right thing, not just as a father, but as a king. And Absalom waits, and he waits, and he waits. The writer of 2 Samuel says that the king did nothing because he loved his son Amnon. But I wonder if the king did nothing because he was paralyzed by his own guilt for what Amnon had done to Tamar, David had done to Bathsheba. Well, after 2 years of nothing, Absalom loses patience. And in a complex scheme, Absalom kills his older brother, Amnon. And even though the king is brokenhearted over the death of his son, the king, once again, does nothing. The writer of 2 Samuel says the king does nothing because he loves Absalom. But I wonder if he did nothing because what Absalom did to Amnon was so close to what David had done to Bathsheba's husband. This old family pattern of truth not told, of problems not resolved, of critical issues simply ignored, pretending that they never, ever, ever happened, is fertile ground for those problematic behaviors to be repeated. We tell tragic stories so we don't end up living tragic lives. Well, Absalom leaves the king's presence in Jerusalem, he goes up north, where he lives for 3 years. For 3 long years, there is no conversation between Absalom and David. And finally, after 3 years, David invites his son to come back to the city. He comes. There's a superficial encounter between the two. Absalom goes to the kingly court. He bows, as is the custom, and David kisses his son. But there's no conversation. There's no discussion. There's no acknowledgement of all the problems that have passed between them. There's no meeting of the minds, no resolution, broken bonds not healed. They just go through the formalities. And the formalities are not enough. I had a friend who was fond of saying, "Time heals all wounds." That is, until he said it in the presence of another friend who disagreed. Time is only an empty room. What matters is how you use it. Neither David nor Absalom used the time well. The distance between them and the issues unresolved never decrease. Well, Absalom starts walking around the city of Jerusalem, acting as if he were king. One of the things the king would do in the ancient times, it would be the judge. And if there were a dispute between two citizens, they would bring that dispute before the king, and the king would resolve it. So Absalom walks through the city of Jerusalem, arbitrating the disputes among the people. King David has to know he's doing it. King David doesn't do anything at all. He never asks Absalom to stop. Then Absalom goes up to Hebron. He sets up a rival government, and many of the people in Israel are more loyal to Absalom than they are to David. Soon a civil war breaks out. And as David's armies leave Jerusalem, they leave with this instruction: deal gently with Absalom for my sake. But it's war. And in war, no one deals gently with anyone else. That's where we pick up the story that Cindy read for us today. David is sitting at the city gate, awaiting news. He sees a runner coming, and the first runner comes and brings the first word that Absalom's armies have been defeated, that David's kingdom is safe. And the city rejoices. But the only thing on David's mind is the safety of his son. The second runner comes, again bringing the same message, only this time David asks, "What of my son, Absalom?" And the news of his son's death falls on his ears. David's prayer that day is hauntingly beautiful. "Oh, my son Absalom, my son, Absalom, would I have died instead of you? Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." David meant it, of course. If he could have done the boys dying for him, he would have. If he could have paid the price for the boys' betrayal of him, he would have. If he could have given his own life to make the boy alive, he would have given it gladly. And as Frederick Buechner points out, even a king can't do things like that. As later history was to prove, it takes a God. For in Jesus Christ, God does die for that rebellious son, as God dies for the rebellion that is within you and me. Jesus did what David could never do. Died in our place. There's a very bright Presbyterian pastor at Madison Avenue Church in New York City. She offers these thoughtful reflections. We know in all tragedies, there's a myriad of lessons to be learned. David and Absalom's is a story of a perilous family secrets and the danger of half-truths. It's a story about harbored disappointments and bitterness and bouts of unforgiving pride. It reveals what happens when forgiveness comes too late, when truth does not bring freedom. Oh, there's much to be learned from David and Absalom, from this father who fails his son and this son who fails his father. But perhaps the greatest lesson, she says, is not to be learned from David and Absalom, but it's about God. For the story of a father and son is a story of lament. But it's nestled into God's grand narrative, a story that promises that even while death and destruction are prevalent, they do not have the final victory. It's not the end of the story. It's an outrageous claim of Christianity, a claim that supposes that while frailty and death are a part of our lives, and we do suffer the consequences of our tragic choices, God's promise brings new life where once there was death. God gathers up all that's been lost. God heals all wounds. God brings light where there was none. This promise doesn't change our past. This promise gives us a future. David got on with his life. He lived to see his son Solomon become king after him. And 1,000 years after David lived, a son is born in David's line, a boy born in Bethlehem, one we would call Messiah, the one who gathered all things to himself and said, I have come to do the will of him who sent me. And the will of him who sent me is that I should lose nothing of all that God has given, but to raise it up on the last day. May the telling of this tragic story set us free from our own tragic trajectories, and may we find in Jesus Christ the graciousness of God, who does not change the past, but who blesses us with a future. Amen.